First segment we're going to do before we get into the main topic, deep or deeper. One of my favorite subsegments because it's just weird, really abstract questions that make y'all think and bring out great content. Um, yeah, the one about the gay marriage versus incest marriage, bro. It's a very interesting question to think about. But with that said, here's the question for today. Should we give more criminals the ability to integrate into society, but in response or in exchange, place chips on them to check their behavior? What do you think?
Hmm.
What makes this question interesting? Because this falls in line with our conversation about freedom versus safety. And what makes this question interesting is because criminals are inherently different because they kind of lose a lot of their citizenship rights in America. So it
So I
makes,
want to hear. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it makes the question very much different versus like any other individual. But that's all I would say.
I want to hear what you think about this first, and then because this is kind of my field that I'm in, um, is criminal justice and courts and law and all that, and right now I'm in a couple of corrections classes. I'm in a couple of criminological theory classes, um, and so this is kind of the thing that we've been talking about a lot lately, and especially like rehabilitation and the theories of punishment. But I want to hear what you think about this first.
As society continues to progress, it's really hard for me to say that moving into a place of increased observance, basically more eyes on you, more specific technology to kind of track who you are and what location you're at, is kind of just going to be the natural progression of society. But in turn, I think it'll be making it more safe. Finding the line will be interesting, but what makes this question a little bit different is because we're focused on criminals. Like you said, we're focused on people who went to jail, and probably think of it, probably to make this easier to digest for people, we're not talking about the druggies, right? We're not talking about them or drug dealers necessarily. Let's try to think of people who probably, when they go back into society, more than likely, based off averages, they're going to recommit a crime. They're probably going to do something potentially bad again. So it's an interesting question considering,
So
because
then why not drug dealers and uh, drug abusers? Because
well,
they're
I
also
wouldn't,
they're very highly likely to reoffend.
yeah, I wouldn't say not them, but the reason why I kind of put them in a separate category is because of potential violence that they can attribute to society or a person. So like someone who just
Okay,
smoked
so
marijuana.
in this, okay, so just to clarify, because this can change my answer a little bit. In this particular scenario, we're talking about violent habitual offenders that we will chip when we release them into society.
Yeah, I think that's a better
Okay.
way to kind of start out the conversation. So violent ones, obviously pedophiles, rape, stuff like that. Those individuals when they go back into society. And for me, I think getting to that place might be okay. And the big part about the question that I brought out is more criminals. So it could potentially allow more people to get out of prison because we know that our prison system can, people say it's overpopulated, as they say. So having more people in prison in general is probably just not good for society as a whole. But if we have a better way to make sure that these people are getting properly rehabilitated by having these type of check on them, like not just a ankle brace or not periodic checks with your probation officer, but something that you can't take out unless you go to some crazy black market and they really do some surgery. But it would be crazy for them to go that far, honestly. So I think eventually a society probably could move into that phase. The main concern for me when it comes to these situations always and will always be that is making sure we have the proper standpoint, meaning that we know exactly what the purpose is and we make sure that there are checks to prevent it from going any further than what it is now. That's always going to be the concern for these situations like these because you can obviously see the abuse of power that could happen from something like this.
Hmm. Hmm.
So ultimately, if it kind of gets more people rehabilitated, gets more people out of prison and back into society, because keeping certain people in there for a long period of time probably is not great. And even if you wanted to add another extra kind of factor to it, whereas maybe for the really violent ones, some of the sexual offenders, even they do come out, maybe even having it where they're not necessarily all just coming back into society. But I know there's like a town that exists for like sexual offenders. Is like all these sexual offenders all go to that one town that exists, and it's like, okay, you're on the registry, nobody's gonna accept you, so come over here.
Hmm.
Possibly something like that could also kind of make this even better for everybody involved as well. But for now, if I had to think about it, I probably would lean this could be beneficial for our criminal justice system overall. Could be. What about you?
So, um, I would not be in favor of this at all. And there's a couple reasons. Firstly, we do pretty much already have it, and we have the electronic monitoring system, the bracelets, and people don't really take those off, and people can't really take those off because there's actually what people don't realize is when they put them on, there is a cord that wraps around it, and if that cord is cut, then it will alert them, and they can't slip it off of their ankle without cutting it the way it's attached. Um, so there's that. We kind of already do have it, but you are right in that a chip in somebody could potentially bring it to another level depending on how you do it. Because you could, if you with the chip like that, you could potentially not need alternative means of figuring out that they're not consuming alcohol or other illicit substances with that chip as opposed to putting on multiple monitors. The issue is this is what people don't realize, and I don't know if you knew this, but when somebody goes to jail, um, and so jail is different than prison in term length and function. But if somebody goes to jail, that means they've been sentenced to less than a year. And I believe the same stands true. I don't know if the same stands true for prison, but I know in Ohio, if you go to jail, you have to pay for your jail sentence. Um, but if you get out on something like electronic monitoring, you also have to buy that monitor and pay for that monitor to function. If we were to have the technology to chip somebody, then that requires a whole lot more money to create that chip. And they're going to have to pay a lot more money to get that chip installed and to function and to keep that chip functioning. Just because the technological advances and the cost of manufacturing a chip like that. Now, one of the issues if the goal is to rehabilitate them is to obviously keep them out of prison. But if we want to keep them out of prison, this is a very common issue that people can have with something like parole is getting them a job in the first place. But if we want to chip them because they're a violent, possibly habitual offender, we're going to have to make them pay for that chip. But if they can't get a job and they can't pay for the chip, then they're not going to make money, which means they're not going to meet their parole requirements, but they're also not going to be able to afford another aspect of the parole environment, which is the paying for the chip, which means we're going to have to throw them back in jail because they violated their parole. In many instances, depending on the charge, a violation of parole is a more serious offense than the actual charge in which they were imprisoned for. And we would just do that cycle over and over and over again. because of the difficulties of parole and the costs of things like that. Um, so and that is only if, I suppose, if the goal is rehabilitation, because one of the things we do know is the longer you spend in prison, the harder it is to rehabilitate you because you're ingrained in that prison culture more and more, and you just distance from society. So that brings up a whole issue of which I'm exploring now, but I don't have to get into that. But if the goal, like you said, is for the purpose of rehabilitation, I think this would be a bad way to do it. Just because it would constantly lead to parole violations.
I will say that inherently based off the process that you're referring to, because yeah, I didn't know that they would have to technically buy or pay for the systems
Mhm,
that are
mhm.
um part of them. But I would say if the
And they're
choice
not cheap
was,
either.
and I would imagine it so, but at the same time you only can feel so sorry for people who are habitual offenders at the same time. I will say this. I feel like if the option was prompted to them, they still would take the chance
Mhm.
to get back into regular society and get out of prison, more often
So,
than not. But I will, it's hard for me to imagine that a system put in place where if you can't afford this technology that you're kind of going out is a good system inherently. Because like for okay, let's put it out there. Let's get some numbers. How much would it an average cost to pay for like the ankle bracelet for an offender?
okay, so the ankle bracelet, um, it goes by the day because they'll send you like 90 days on an ankle monitoring system or something like that. I bet you I can look it up. I'll look up for Ohio. I wanna say it's not cheap.
I would
Um,
yeah, I would imagine it wouldn't be cheap.
I'll look it up here. Um,
Uh, and the reason why I'm asking this is that in if, even from like I'm sure the price that you're about to bring up is going to be extremely expensive. I feel like there's probably a reasonable understanding, and I might be wrong, of if someone gets
okay.
a job and them not being able to afford the technology regardless is more of a situation of happenstance versus them not trying to rehabilitate. But go ahead.
So, okay, so it'll depend on a couple of things, but this is for an electronic monitoring in Oregon. So different places will have different fees, and you can also use different companies. But so this is from Oregon Municipal Court. Costs without a stalker alert is $10 per day and a $20 installation fee, as well as $90 due at the time of installation, and $80 due each week thereafter until the case is over. Um, so yeah. So it'll depend on the day and how long you are there and how long it is. But if you're going to do a stalker alert, which will essentially implement as well as GPS unit inside of it to make sure that they stay away from somebody if they were
Right.
charged with some kind of um, protection order violation, then it would go to $12 per day and $20 installation fee payable in the following. And so $104 due at the time of installation. This is for 7 days of monitoring. But nobody's going to sentence to just 7 days on a monitor like that. It'll be something more like 15 days upwards to like, I think the longest I ever saw was 90 days on a monitoring unit.
Hmm. Uh,
So,
I mean, for now, it's really. I mean, to be fair, I don't know how much it would cost to kind of create a chip, but I do think we probably could reach a point in time, if not now, it currently exists, where there are certain ways of technology, because there are certain instances where technology is more advanced, but it is cheaper because of how it's made. So it would
yeah.
be interesting to see. Someone said experts have studied it, concluded that if a person doesn't choose to do crime, the likelihood of needing an ankle brace is dramatically reduced. You know what? I feel like I agree. People shouldn't choose to do
What did
crime.
he say? Well, yeah. Um, Yeah, so there's a lot of, and this gets to ultimately what is the goal of punishment, right? And so if the goal of punishment is focusing like we have been for the last since the 70s, so the last 50 years, we have focused away from the victim to the defendant, to the offender. So our goal in punishment is for rehabilitation, is the very current thing in the criminal justice community. And so we spend a lot more resources on the offenders and trying to get them back into society. But the issue is we really don't know why people commit crimes. There's a lot of different theories about that. There's something like the social learning theory, which is partly true. People learn offense, they learn criminality from peers. But that gets back to the issue of, obviously, that's not a theory that can be extrapolated back for very far, because at some point one of the peers had to decide for the first time that they're going to commit a crime. Why did they do that? Well, you can look at the
Right.
rational choice theory, and you could just go on, and nobody really knows why, and everybody,
I
of course, is
think
obsessed.
the issue there is that the and to be fair, I mean, based off your study, maybe it's they're not technically trying to do this, but anytime you
Mhm,
try to find one theory to solve a big problem, I don't think
mhm.
you'll ever kind of get where you want,
Oh,
because
I
like
agree entirely.
yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people commit crime. What I mean,
Mhm,
you can go the simplistic way where there's people that are socio or psychopath. You can go to the Robin Hood way where it's like, okay,
mhm.
by circumstance, they got to do this to survive. Like, there's a
Yep.
lot of different reasons.
Oh,
But
yeah.
overall, for me, when it comes to prison, I only can see two ways to really go about these the prisoners, and it really should be either rehabilitation or just, hey man, get them out of here. So it should
So
keeping
wait,
people in.
are you pro death penalty?
Yeah, yeah. Certain
I
people
think
just
we talked
gotta.
about that one time.
I don't think we
Yeah.
did,
I
but
think
I think certain people should
we might have talked
get
about
out
it
of here.
afterwards one day is what I was saying. Um,
Yeah, it's like there's
but
no reason why we got to rehabilitate Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Like,
mm,
there's really no reason why we got to do all that.
this is, I don't want to belabor the point if we got to move on to something else, but I I'm not a fan of the rehabilitative model. Um, because certain people just will not be rehabilitated. This is one of the
Right.
issues with rehabilitation and the theories is they're trying to come up with ways of rehabilitating people of which many of them do not wish to be rehabilitated. Um, and so you can't force rehabilitation on somebody. And I've seen it many times is that somebody gets put on a program and they complete the program, but then we see them back 2 weeks anyways, in another week or so, because they do what they say the things that need to be said and they do the things that need to be done so they can get out and continue exactly the way that they were living before, which means and which means we need to find a punishment for them that is just and that they have paid back their debt to society is, you violated this way,
Yeah.
and this punishment is swift, and this is what all of the research has suggested. This is everybody's very upset about the tough on crime era because it jacked up a lot of the penalties, but it didn't really do much to deter crime. And this is one of the issues,
Right.
especially with more recent crime, is simultaneously the punishments will get worse, but we see now a lot of the DAs are telling their prosecutors not to prosecute certain crimes. So the severity of the punishment is very high, but the certainty of punishment is very low. Very, very few people believe that they're going to get caught, and fewer believe that if they're going to get caught, they're not going to get the maximum penalty because of plea bargaining, which is just comes with the turf. You're not going to get around plea bargains.
So I'm glad you brought that up, and the not the necessarily the criminal justice part, because that will be conversation for another day. But in terms of the individuals that inherently will never get rehabilitated, right? So they're not as bad as Jeffrey Dahmer, but they kind of live in anarchy basically, or ingrained in it to the extent where they just will never see themselves kind of be on the up and narrow. So that kind of begs another question. At that point, the only solution for me is embedding fear into them. And that's what something like a chip would do. It would embed that fear that, okay, you can go out, but just know that we're watching. We watching what you're doing. And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, the keeping them in the prison the entire time doesn't benefit anybody really. It doesn't really benefit our society as a
Yeah.
whole. So
Hmm.
it's just better for, even like if you want to think like based off a societal model, having another person who's out there working is just best for society as a whole. So
Yeah.
those
The issue.
people, yeah, go ahead, go for it.
The issue with that is right. You just said that leaving them in prison isn't going to do much for them, right? Um, but the problem is if we know that they're not going to be rehabilitated, we put the chip in there.
Mm-hmm.
Then what's the point of the chip? Because we don't want to throw them back in prison because we want somebody working. But the reason that they're offending in the first place is because they don't want to work and they need resources, so they're going to find a way to get those resources without obeying those constraints of society, which gets into the concept of incapacitation. The one of there's four theories of punishment. There's retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. Incapacitation says you're not going to be a benefit to society in any way, shape, or form. So we're simply going to remove you from society. Because as long as you're in society, we talked about the social learning theory, you are going to influence other people to follow along in those footsteps. Many criminals, one of the issues that they have is they have many, many kids, and they're constantly belabored on all sides by mothers seeking money from them to try to support their kids and their genealogy. But they won't do it. And so they get huge taxes and huge penalties um, from the courts saying that they owe these people money. And so when they get caught, they are caught with like 30 warrants for different court mandates and different court money. But they're not working in the first place, so they're not going to be able to pay for it. So we throw them in prison because they're violating court orders, and they of course have many other problems along with that. And I'm just making up numbers, right? Not quite 30. I'm being a little bit,
Right.
dramatic. But the benefit to society is not having them stay in society just knowing that they're being watched. They don't really care if they're being watched anyways. Many of them are on probation. I mean, they have to report to a probation officer all the time. And so they effectively know that they're being watched and that they're going to get caught at some point or other. Um, so there's not much point in shipping them. The best solution for these people who are refused to be rehabilitated, not due to lack of effort, but they just aren't going to be rehabilitated, is to just incapacitate them. If because this is what people have a misconception. The judge does not hit when the judge takes an oath, he takes an oath to uphold and preserve what is good for his society as a whole. So Judge Aram, Judge Ohanian of my court, probably shouldn't have said that because now some crazy person's gonna look up where I live. But um he swore to protect and defend the rights of the citizens in the city in which he is the judge. So he looks out for the public and the society as a whole. And if the offender is going to be served by that moving forward of the justice for the city in which he is good or in which he is in, then that's good and will work with that offender. But if that person is going to be contradictory towards the public health as a whole, then we must remove him from that society because the judge owes a debt to society, not to that offender. And so we have to look out for what is good for society as a whole. And if we're going to have all of these people who refuse to be rehabilitated just parading through the streets, causing anarchy, then we need to remove them from society, which is a very unpopular thing to say.
So for me, and this is the final thing I'll say about it, for me is that I think the chip inherently will provide a better, basically, coverage of the individual. I mean, parole is, good for what it is, but obviously we know it's somewhat momentary, and there's a lot of time in between that you don't exactly know what they're doing, who they're talking to, X, Y, and Z.
Mhm.
If the chip works based off how we're kind of imagining it, it would have a lot of information about the person and what they're doing on a very pretty much consistent basis, to the point where the idea that they can kind of escape the rules and do something else to survive, it would be utterly impossible. It'd be basically, you know, it's tough to say that, but they would basically be on 24-hour watch for the
Yeah,
most part.
I
So
got
with
you.
the,
Yep.
so in that situation, because of the lack of ability to do anything but actually work, there's really no way that they can kind of buy into that criminal behavior. Now, with that said, those people knowing that they're still being watched and go like, I just can't do this, at that point I think there is something to be said that they should be incapacitated. And I would say there probably could be a system where there are people out there that just want, okay, tell me what to do every day, give me food, give me a place to sleep, that's fine.
Yeah,
um
I
so
understand the concept behind it. This is the one flaw that I can see in that, and then I'll be done. Um, if you were to do something like that, there would have to be some policy that gets passed along with that technology to ensure that criminals can get jobs at places. Because the one issue is, right, they want to work when they get out, but they can't get a job because they're labeled as prisoners,
right,
right? They
yeah,
have that public record that can be found at any time. And I think, that comes with the turf. People should know that depending on your crime, I think if you're applying for a job in which your criminal record is uh important information, like, you're a sex predator and you're trying to work at a school, then I think you should have to do that. But I think if granting the premise that we want to rehabilitate people, and I'm not saying that we don't want to rehabilitate people, obviously, but if that's the premise we're going off of, then we would need to make sure that I don't think we want their criminal record gone immediately. But maybe if I'm applying at a hard labor job and my offense has nothing to do with this work, then my criminal record doesn't exist at that point. But if it is, then they can access it.
right.
That way they can get work, pay for the chip, and be productive in society.